Hi everybody, my name is Stephanie Pokris and I am a senior history major here at the College of Worcester. And today I would like to talk to you guys all about my senior thesis, Whose Line Is It Anyways? Rhetoric, Pathology, and the Jewish Race in Late Victorian England. This is going to be a more in-depth look into one particular section, but if you'd like to learn more about my project and broader overview, please see my other media on my Senior IS page. And so let's begin. So the historical question I was engaging with in my research was, how did late Victorian Anglo-Jews use rhetoric of race science and Jewish pathology to encode lines of difference? And my project fundamentally does three main things. First, it complicates traditional definitions of anti-Semitism. Second, it challenges this hegemonic dominant narrative that Jews were passive victims of anti-Semitism and didn't have historical agency. And lastly, I'm challenging understandings about who could use and even own eugenicist dialogue. And eugenics just refers to the field of science dedicated to the improvement of human racial hereditary strength through things like selective breeding. So my overall project looks at three categories of discourse that were happening in late Victorian England surrounding Jewish race pathology, or the condition of Jewish bodies. The first is Gentile discourse, where I'm kind of looking at how non-Jews spoke about Jews and conceived of and structured their perceptions of the Jewish body. The second is Jewish expert discourses, and by this I mean discourses that were focused or written by scientists and meant to be scholarly in their kind of audience. And lastly, in my third chapter, I look at Jewish popular discourses, which is a much wider and less rigorous field of media platforms, and also includes voices of minorities within the Jewish community, including women and immigrants. I wish I had time to go in depth into my whole thesis, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on my second chapter, which basically argues that Jewish race scientists used rhetoric of race science and eugenics in order to understand and kind of define a new Jewish identity in a Jewish community which was becoming increasingly diverse due to massive waves of immigration that were happening at the time. So, as I mentioned, there's these massive waves of immigration that were occurring in the late Victorian Jewish community. So prior to these waves of immigration, there was a small, incredibly assimilated population of Jews in England called native Jews. And these Jews were almost entirely English in conduct and lifestyle, with the exception that they did participate in some Jewish religious practice and identified racially as Jewish, even though they participated in English non-Jewish social spheres. And so an example of that you can see here on the left, this is Lord Walter Rothschild, who was, the Rothschilds were the first Jewish family to become nobility or peers in England. And he represents kind of one contingent of the Jewish community in late Victorian England. However, in 1880, there was an incredibly large wave of immigration into England of Jewish immigrants fleeing the pogroms in Russia. And there was almost 100,000 immigrants who came in, the vast majority of whom settled in the East End of London. And these immigrants challenged native Jewish conceptions of what Jewish identity was, because they looked different, spoke different languages, ate different foods, had different religious practice. And so one tool which the Jewish community used to kind of engage with this changing population dynamic was race science, in order to kind of make sense of what Jewish identity is and how to kind of incorporate the position and experiences of immigrants into this broader community definition of Jewish identity. So one of the immediate responses from this massive wave of immigration was a project of assimilation among the native Jews, who feared that the Jewish immigrants would lead to a rise of anti-Semitism in England. And this was contextualized by larger trends in England towards anti-immigration reform and xenophobia, which focused on the idea that immigrants were immoral and diseased and unclean. And so the native Jewish population was, very concerned about the reputation of immigrants reflecting on the Jewish community as a whole. And we can see this in the Jewish Chronicle, which was the primary native Jewish newspaper at the time. And in an article titled "The Work to be Done," the Chronicle wrote, "The world outside is not capable of making minute discriminations between Jew and Jew, and forms its opinions of Jews in general as much, if not more, from immigrants than the anglicized portion of the community. It is tolerably clear what we wish to do to our foreign poor. We may not be able to make them rich, but we can hope to render them English in feeling and conduct." And so we can see here that there was this kind of deep-seated anxiety that non-Jews would not be able to distinguish assimilated Jews from immigrant Jews, and therefore the answer would be to make the immigrant Jews assimilated and therefore not a cause of potential anti-Semitism. And one of the tools that was used to do this and justify this was race science. And the best example of this is the work of the race scientist Joseph Jacobs. Joseph Jacobs is actually best known as a folklorist for popularizing English versions of fairy tales of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Jack and the Beanstalk, among others. However, he was also a race scientist, and he occupied a particularly unique and interesting position as a Jewish race scientist because not only was he producing scholarship within the Jewish community, but also within the Gentile or non-Jewish community. Joseph Jacobs actually did a lot of work on identifying the Jewish type with Francis Galton, who is largely considered to be the father of eugenics. Joseph Jacobs' work on race science has a very particularly objective scientific tone to it. He never enters his own opinions or anything that he cannot back by scientific fact. And he really kind of embeds himself in this culture of eugenics and race scientists. And this, to our contemporary sensibilities, might seem like a contradiction. And one way which scholars have tried to resolve that is by saying that Joseph Jacobs was only engaging in eugenicist discourse, which is traditionally kind of considered to be an anti-Semitic discourse, in order to fight anti-Semitism as kind of a heroic figure for the Jewish community. However, this reading is really anachronistic because Joseph Jacobs once said, "Here in England, we are almost absolutely free from any taint of anti-Semitism." So Joseph Jacobs couldn't have been fighting a battle against anti-Semitism using race science because he didn't think it existed. The reality is that Joseph Jacobs was participating in a larger cultural milieu in which race science and comparisons of race were embedded on every level of culture and kind of comparison in society at the time, both within the Gentile community and the Jewish community. And so responding to that, Joseph Jacobs sees race science as a valuable and incredibly persuasive tool to both justify the project for assimilation and assimilate Jews. And indeed, the only time Joseph Jacobs veers from his very objective scientific tone in his writing is when he talks about this project of assimilation. And he writes, "I cannot refrain from pointing out the very obvious conclusion from the above calculations that the immediate problem before the Jews of London is to anglicize their foreign contingent. Owing to the large numbers of foreign poor, the death rate of London Jews is quite exceptionally higher than that of Londoners in general. We may anticipate this condition will only be temporary until the foreign contingent has been assimilated." Now, the really important thing here is the emphasis on the death rates of London Jews. So the way kind of racial comparison or race science worked at the time and cultural kind of capital worked at the time was that it was an issue of comparison. And so Joseph Jacobs is very worried and anxious about how Jews look in comparison to Gentiles, because that comparison is what's going to establish Jewish position in society as it starts to restructure itself among this kind of emphasis on race science and eugenics. And so the idea here is that he can prove through race science that assimilation is not only one of the best, but perhaps the only way to shrink the gap between Jews and Gentiles in these statistical comparisons, and therefore preserve the Jewish social position as, at least politically, if not entirely socially, equal to their Gentile peers. There was a second project happening among the Jewish community at the time that also drew on this rhetoric of race science, and this was a native Jewish project to gain social capital. So, as I mentioned, Jews uniquely in England had a level of political equality that was parallel to that of their Gentile peers. However, they were socially still considered other and often operated a position as being an object of exotic fascination among their Gentile peers. And as a result, there was this desire among Jews to become social equals because they weren't yet. And they were actually in a position to do it using the kind of social status that they had already managed to gain. And race science was one tool which these native Jews could harness in order to prove equality. And this was contextualized by this idea that, Britain was in a Darwinistic imperial competition with other nations in which only the strong would survive. And therefore, everything that was of value in England had to go towards the hereditary strength of the empire. And so in that sense, this idea of hereditary strength became almost a form of social currency or social capital, which Jews, if they could prove their hereditary strength, could accrue. And that led to this kind of project where Jews were using eugenics and race science in order to try to demonstrate their racial equality to Gentiles. And this is very well seen in an article in the Jewish Chronicle, which was actually an interview with Francis Galton, which reads, "It may be said that from the days of Moses, Jews have been eugenicists. The intense love of children and the idealization of the home life have contributed in notable degree to the production of a race that has withstood greater trials and tribulations that have befallen any other race in history." So here we can kind of see two really important things. First, the emphasis that Jews have been practicing eugenics from biblical times to now is important because eugenics is a science which improves the hereditary strength of those who practice it. And so this would assert that Jews have been practicing this kind of increase in hereditary strength for thousands of years longer than their English peers. In addition, the emphasis here on the trials and tribulations that the Jewish race has faced is really important because it almost, and you can see this more explicitly later in the article, compares the persecution that Jews faced systemically through history to a form of natural selection. In a sense, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And through surviving this intense discrimination, the Jews have been able to evolve to become a hereditarily stronger race, which is equal to that of the Gentile population in England. So there are four really important implications for this. First is this really helps us to understand how England learned to deal with racial diversity on her own shores. The Jews were the largest racial minority group inside the actual borders of England itself, and it was pretty much the only racial group that England came into contact with at the time outside of an imperial movement. And so it reveals a lot about how England learned to kind of navigate racial diversity. Secondly, this also complicates the diasporic Jewish experience in Europe, especially whether or not Jews had agency. If Jews were producing this scholarship and harnessing this rhetoric in order to self-determine, then Jews themselves were historical agents, and this adds layers onto traditional kind of paintings of Jews as merely victims. Thirdly, this kind of rhetoric was incredibly influential in the redefinition of Jewish identity in the United States, which was also experiencing a massive wave of Jewish immigration and had a major cultural exchange with the English Jewish community. And lastly, this rhetoric sets the stage for later acts of anti-Semitism, which were fundamentally informed by the construction of eugenics in the 19th century. And that is what I have for you today. If you have any questions, feel free to send me anything from the chat and I'd be happy to answer them. So thank you.